The word transgender is controversial to say the least.
J.K. Rowling sparked outrage last weekend with a series of controversial tweets about trans women.
Transgender women were banned from cricket and football teams in England.
She is the first transgender athlete to be crowned NCAA champion, but not without controversy.
Texas, now the largest state to block gender-affirming care for transgender children.
There are only two genders, male and female.
Now, this documentary isn't about the politics. The reason I mentioned all of this is to show how much cultural attention this topic commands. Sure, we'll get into a little politics just to understand the background of this topic or to separate the politics from the science. But this is about understanding the trans landscape, understanding what makes a person transgender. Why has there been a 4,000-fold increase in the past few years? And what makes someone trans? Is it social contagion or biology? These are all questions we'll be looking into. You see both sides, the sides of trans activism and the side against it, claim to take their stance with compassion and justify their stance using science. While a lot of people just use these terms to justify their tribalism, self-righteousness and transphobia, there are people with genuine positive intention on both the sides. However, positive intent doesn't guarantee positive outcomes. In the 1900s, when the British were in India, they announced that they would pay a bounty for every dead cobra brought to them. And at first this worked. However, soon enough the locals just started breeding the cobras instead of hunting them down. On realizing this, the British cancelled the program and the locals left with worthless snakes just released them in the city. And this led to the opposite outcome. It increased the cobra population instead of decreasing it. We have seen the cobra effect pan out in psychiatry and psychology as recent as the 1980s and 1990s with the repressed memories craze, or even worse, we have seen ovariotomy. Leading psychiatrists and gynecologists in the 19th century believed that you could cure mental illnesses in women by removing their ovaries. The inventors of this method were even awarded the Nobel Prize. Self-reports of women seeing positive outcomes from this procedure were even published. 100,000 ovariotomies were performed, resulting in the death of 30% of all of these patients. The only way we can make sure the cobra effect doesn't happen again is by asking questions, by considering opposing arguments. And it's only by asking questions can you make sure you aren't a bigot. Unfortunately, when it comes to gender, people almost always stop thinking. And so I just want to make sense of this matter. And to do this, I talk to trans people, do my own research, and I even interviewed a neuroscience professor to get to know this better. There's no hidden agenda. This is just my honest understanding. This is understanding the trans landscape. So what does it mean to be a transgender person? And have they always existed, or is this a social phenomena which has sprung into existence in recent times? To understand this, we need to go back in time to when the term transgender was first coined. In fact, we have to go before that. Because by definition, a transgender person is someone whose gender identity doesn't match the sex they were assigned to at birth. That means it's rooted in the belief that sex and gender are two distinct things. The first time this distinction was recorded was in 1945 when the psychologist Madison Bentley published his book Hazard in Childhood, defining gender as the obverse of sex. Prior to this, the word gender had a different meaning. It referred to grammatical categories. Then in 1955, the controversial Johns Hopkins professor John Money coined the terms gender role and sexual orientation. Then in the 1960s, the word gender identity is coined. It's defined as the self-image of belonging to a certain sex. Finally, in 1965, the term transgenderism is coined. But you see, that was only when it was coined in English. The German term transsexualismus was already given by the sexologist Hirschfeld all the way in 1931. In fact, Hirschfeld had already conducted the first sex reassignment surgery all the way in 1906. That's when I realized that a problem with my research was that it was only focused on a certain part of the world. If I look at here in India, we've had the Hijras community, which have existed even before Mughal rule, all the way back in the 15th century. The Hijras even held positions of power during the Mughal rule and only became a marginalized group in 1841 after the British criminalized them. But perhaps the earliest evidence for transgender people goes back all the way to the 3rd century BCE, with the existence of the galley priests These priests often dressed to have a feminine appearance, identified as females, and even castrated themselves. Coming back to 1968, the DSM-2 is out, and it has no mention of transgenderism. For those of you who don't know, the DSM is published by the American Psychiatric Association, and it's basically the manual for diagnosing mental health disorders. Then in the 1970s, with the rise of feminism, the idea that gender is a social construct catches on, with statements like, "A woman is not born but made," popularizing this idea. Then in 1980, the DSM-3 is out, and transsexualism is introduced. In 1994, DSM-4 is out, and transsexualism is removed from the DSM and replaced with just gender identity disorder. Why was this change made? It was to broaden the diagnosis, because transsexualism only refers to a person who is seeking clinical transition, whereas gender identity refers to someone with just the incongruence of their gender identity and sex they were assigned to at birth. And in 2013, the DSM-5 is out, and it removes gender identity disorder to replace it with gender dysphoria. But why was this change made? Was there any medical reason behind it, or was it a politically motivated move? Indeed, the trans activist group WPATH, or World Professional Association for Transgender Health, lobbied for this change because, one, the word gender dysphoria doesn't have the word disorder in it, and in this way it would depathologize the diagnosis. But when I looked deeper, this is when things got interesting. I found the complete opposite of what I was expecting. The APA member who chaired this decision was the psychologist-sexologist Kenneth Zucker, who supposedly practiced conversion therapy, and even more interestingly, trans group had passed a petition receiving 9,500 signatures to get him removed from the board. So first off, how did a guy practicing conversion therapy even make it to such a position in the American Psychiatric Association? And second, why did he make a decision which the trans groups who hated him wanted? Kenneth Zucker, in an interview, explains what happened.
WPATH had a very minimal influence on anything that we did. I would say that maybe the biggest influence that they had was changing the diagnostic label from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. And for me, as a psychologist, gender dysphoria is a completely reasonable diagnostic label. It's phenomenological. It's getting at subjectivity.
So it turns out trans groups just influence the name of this label and not the diagnosis itself. Okay, that's fine, but what about conversion therapy? And I think it's important to delve into this because his approach is something we'll talk about later on as well. For those of you who don't know, conversion therapy is a practice with a horrific history. So in 2015, when Zucker was fired from his clinic for false claims put against him, and on realizing these claims were untrue, he was compensated with more than $500,000. This touches upon the problem trans activist groups can bring when it comes to medical practice. What he was just doing was helping trans people explore their feelings. And it's not conversion therapy, as he's one of the first people in North America to prescribe hormones for transitioning. His approach could be considered as what is known as the gender exploratory approach. But more interesting than his approach is what Zucker found in his studies. 88% of prepubescent children with gender ambiguity desist over time, meaning they stop being transgender over time. But another study by Christina Olson found the complete opposite. In 82% of cases, found that childhood gender dysphoria persists even after a 5-year follow-up. So who's right? Is being transgender merely a phase? How do we reconcile these two contradicting pieces of evidence? Again, Zucker explains...
A very high percentage of kids who socially transition long before puberty stay socially transitioned by mid-adolescence.
Turns out the disparity is there because in Olson's sample, the kids being studied have already undergone a social transition. While in Zucker's case, these children came with gender ambiguity. They hadn't transitioned yet, and they often underwent Zucker's gender exploratory therapy. And so that brings us to the next question. What's the right method of treatment? Just as trans activists have criticized Zucker's conservative approach of restraining from prescribing medication, so has the opposite approach, or the gender-affirming approach, has faced criticism. The Tavistock Hospital in the UK had to shut down after a former patient went to court saying she hadn't been challenged enough on her decision to transition. And this ambiguity in how to go about treatment is what causes polarization and worry. But before we even talk about the treatment, we need to truly understand what makes people transgender. I spoke to two transgender female to male folks to understand this. I first spoke to Ashna, who went from being the head girl of a convent school to transitioning into being a male. And so I asked him about his story. This is what he said.
So my first experiences of with dysphoria was when I was 4. Remember, there was this school dance and I had to wear a lehenga and it was like a short blouse and I was so uncomfortable. But I couldn't tell where I was uncomfortable and what was making me uncomfortable. But I think I was 17. That's when I realized that there's something about my gender that affects me. So I initially went by calling myself gender fluid. Later on, I realized that this part of me that was girl-like was more of my persona self that I had created over the years. So essentially, I was playing this part almost like acting.
And did you
Basically,
feel
everything-
uncomfortable when you were acting feminine?
Where I was in public, it felt natural. But the moment I came home, I would feel exhausted, absolutely tired. But I couldn't connect the dots back then.
It has always been there, but during puberty, you started to sort of realize what was going on.
Yes.
So, what all have you done to transition?
So I had top surgery last year. And then this year in February, I started taking HRT.
After which I spoke to Ayush and he made it clear that it is not a decision, it's not a choice.
It's a horrible experience. I hate being trans. Like, it's not easy. Nobody would choose this. And people need to understand that it's already hard enough. I think it should be treated the same as any other serious condition.
And this is how he described his transition
So
journey.
when I was in middle school, when I was 12, it was the internet. I consumed a lot of trans media, and at first it was like I'm an ally, but then it made me question a lot of things about myself. I started experimenting with pronouns. So first I started using they, them, and then he, they, and then he, him. So it wasn't like a eureka moment where I was like, okay, I'm transgender. Like, I was very doubtful. A lot of the time, it felt like I was just following a trend. I wasn't actually trans. So it took a while. And then I started identifying as a binary man at 14. So it took about 2 years.
Now, Ayush's story with him mentioning trans media couldn't help but make me ask how much of it is social contagion and how much of being transgender is really biological. And so let's start by looking at the biological causes or possible explanations for creating transgender people. But before we even go into the causes, I want to make it clear that sex determination is not as black and white as it seems. I'm a male with XY chromosomes, but I was shocked to find out that I have XX chromosomes, or the chromosomes found in female as well.
If you are male, you got some of mom's stem cells in your circulation when you were a fetus, and some of those got into your brain, and you've got some neurons that are XX in there.
And so when Ben Shapiro said,
"Facts don't care about your feelings. Every cell in Caitlyn Jenner's body is male with the exception of some of his sperm cells,"
he was in fact wrong. There was even this case where doctors on operating a grandfather found fallopian tubes, an ovary, and a cervix in his body. There's this tribe in Africa which has found to have this condition where some of the males are born with low testosterone levels, and so even though they have XY chromosomes, their genitals appear feminine. However, on reaching puberty, their testosterone levels shoot up and they develop male genitalia. I'm not arguing that there is a third sex or that there are more than two sexes. All I'm saying is biology isn't as boxed out as many of us might think it is, and so it's important to keep our minds open when exploring this topic. Now, coming to the biological causes. There's limited proof that there are any genes linked with being transgender. However, being transgender is more prevalent with identical twins than non-identical twins. But we don't know if this is causation or mere correlation. But it might suggest that there are prenatal causes to being transgender. In fact, if you look at the controversial and famous case of David Reimer, he was born male, but his circumcision went wrong and he lost his penis. And so he was surgically made to have female genitalia. The surgery was done by the Professor John Money, who also coined the terms gender role and sexual orientation. He believed that gender identity was a social construct and that by raising Reimer as a female, he would identify as a female. Unfortunately, Reimer was never happy with his female body and later on transitioned back into being a male, and he tragically took his own life. And this case pushed forward the idea that there is a biological component to gender identity, perhaps it has a lot to do with the influence of prenatal hormones. And indeed, increased testosterone exposure in XX females leads to a condition known as congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where XX chromosome females are born and raised as females. However, they often identify as males, cross-dress to have male clothing, and show male preferences. And all of this is just because of increased testosterone exposure during birth. Phthalates, the chemicals used to manufacture plastic, have also shown to increase the risk of developing autism and gender dysphoria. Certain medication during pregnancy can also increase the risk of developing transsexuality. See, in humans, the genitals differentiate in the first trimester, whereas the brain differentiates only in the second trimester. That means, hypothetically, it is possible in rare cases for both of these processes to go uncoordinated, resulting in transgender individuals. And so, that brings us to the question, are the brains of transgender people really different from that of cisgender people? But before we even go there, we need to understand if male and female brains are different in the first place.
What about sexual dimorphism in just males and females? How are the brains of cisgender males and cisgender females different?
That's a good question. It has a long answer. There are various, if you look for parts of the brain that show sex-based differences, let's say in humans or in other animals, you'll find a list. But if you look at the question of brain areas and or behaviors that show similarities versus differences, you have more similarities, vastly more similarities than differences.
So if I had a male and female brain put in front of you, would you be able to tell the difference just by looking at it?
If you're controlling for all of the various factors that correlate with biological sex, including height and weight, if you don't control for them, you might have some guess. If you do control for them, then it would be hard to tell. But men are on the average taller and heavier. And so their brains tend to be bigger, not bigger than say the difference between a bigger man and a smaller man.
Right, so most of the differences seen in the brains are mostly due to the physical differences between male and female and not so much with their identity or sense of identity.
Well, male and female identity that has very rarely been assessed. It's just been assumed from bodies. So yes, the degree of identification with male or femaleness, none of this has really been studied very strongly.
But nonetheless, there have been brain studies which show functional differences between transgender and cisgender brains.
A study done by Professor Julie Baker.
Her study involved 160 participants, and using an MRI, she studied the brain activation patterns of individuals when exposed to pheromones, which are known to trigger gender-specific brain activity. What she found was that the transgender brain scans of both males and females matched more with the desired sex's brain scans rather than the cisgender brain scans of the sex they were assigned to at birth. And what she also found was that gender dysphoric adolescent girls had brain activation patterns of that typically found in males while solving visual spatial memory exercises. Now, even Baker acknowledges that there has to be more studies done in this field, but all of this shows that there is a biological component to being transgender. And so if being transgender has to do with the way your brain is wired, does that mean therapy is useless and sex reassignment surgery is the only satisfactory treatment? That was what I was starting to think until Professor Bittu said this.
There's no real distinction between the neurobiological and the psychological, right? All behavior emerges from the brain and the interaction of the brain with various other parts of the body. So there isn't a distinction between these two. Again, there's no distinction between the neurological and the sociological either, in the sense that there's a distinction between the two. But the sociological shapes the neurological, and then the neurological shapes behavior, which in turn shapes the way in which one socializes. So this is just to say that you can never extricate socialization from what's happening. Everything affects brain structures, but it's not as if sociological influences can eliminate the way in which somebody's gender identity exists, right? And so the problem with the therapy can fix being trans is not a problem with what therapy can do so much as the idea that something needs to be fixed.
Now, as Professor Bittu said, we cannot extricate the psychosocial components from the biological components while studying the brain. I still think it's important to look at some of the psychosocial factors linked with trans identity, starting with one study which showed
that there is growing evidence that childhood abuse, neglect, maltreatment, and physical or sexual abuse may be associated with gender dysphoria. Between the years 2008 and 2009 and 2017 and 2018, there was a 4,000% increase of transgender cases in females.
The number of children diagnosed with gender dysphoria has soared almost 50-fold, or to put it another way, 4,900%.
And just by looking at that study, it might seem obvious this rise in cases is because of a social contagion. However, the statistic is misleading,
as the rise in cases is only a jump of 1,800, which isn't a lot for a country whose population is more than 65 million and whose population has risen by more than 3 million in the same time period.
Lisa Littman from Brown University proposed the rapid onset of gender dysphoria hypothesis. And yes, the paper did have its flaws, like it only used parent reports rather than the reports of the transgender children themselves, and that the sample was highly selected. Brown University was forced to retract the paper because of political pressure, which is not how academia is supposed to work. Usually when something is wrong, when a paper published is wrong, someone else just publishes another paper disproving the study. However, this was not the case, and this just makes studying the social contagion aspect of gender dysphoria harder. But all of this does not eliminate the fact that there are false positives. According to this Canadian sexologist James Cantor, BPD begins to manifest in adolescence, is 3 times more common in biological females than males, and occurs in 2 to 3% of the population. Therefore, Cantor argues if even only a portion of people with BPD experienced an identity disturbance that focused on gender identity and were mistaken for transgender, they could easily overwhelm the number of genuine cases of gender dysphoria. The Baywater Support Group, which is a transgender support group, found that 50% of its members often came out as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And so one possible explanation for this is a lot of homosexuals have internalized homophobia, which leads them to identifying as trans rather than as homosexual. Again, that's just a possible explanation. And so now all of this establishes that there is a biological as well as psychosocial aspect to being trans.
And so this brings us to the next question.
What is the best method of treatment?
To understand this, I asked Ashna about his journey. So it's been more than a year since you have done your top surgery. How did you feel right after it was done? How do you feel now?
I was self-harming before I got top surgery. It was like a very important point in my timeline for my family to realize that this is something that I need to get done with, or I won't be able to survive. But yeah, it did make me happy. Just after the surgery, when I looked at myself with the bandages and everything, but I was flat, it didn't feel like anything. It felt like, yeah, this is how it's supposed to be. I look like myself, It was like this strange sense of familiarity for a body that I didn't have for a very long time. Like I was finally home.
So it never brought you any sense of regret at any time?
Never. Maybe with the details of the surgery itself, it looked the doctor's job basically. But the fact that I did surgery itself, there was no regret about it.
I found the "it felt home" statement particularly interesting because it reminds me of a study on phantom penises.
I'll let Dr. Sapolsky explain.
60% of men who've had to have their penises removed because of cancer there wind up getting phantom penile sensations. When you take transgendered individuals who go from male to female, in other words, as part of it, having their penises removed, 0% rate of penile phantom sensation. Suggestion being that there is something much more normal in that case than when a penis is being removed for cancer, a whole new area of research.
But that was his experience. What about other people? What do the studies have to say? A Cornell literature review looked at all the articles written on the matter, published between 1991 and June 2017, and 93% of the studies showed that gender transition improves the overall well-being of the transgender person, while only 4 studies reported null or mixed findings, and that no studies concluded that transitioning causes overall harm. Even a 2012 study showed that 4 months post-surgery, there's a significant improvement in psychosocial well-being and sexual well-being. But a problem with these studies is that they have a small follow-up rate and a short follow-up period. One study showed that 76% of detransitioners did not contact their clinic to inform their feelings of dissatisfaction. Another study talked about the honeymoon effect, where patients 2 to 5 years after the sex reassignment surgery reported positive feelings. However, post that, there was often regret. A more recent study published in 2024 showed that 27% of patients who had undergone pubertal suppression followed by sex reassignment surgery reported reproductive regret. And the leaked WPATH files released by Michael Scherenberger, the same guy who released the Twitter files, shows that WPATH is aware of the study. The president of WPATH, Dr. Macy Bowers, in response to transition regrets, merely states, patients need to own and take responsibility for medical decisions. Instead of acknowledging potential miscalculations, misjudgments in the diagnosis.
Further, Bowers goes on to compare gender reassignment surgeries with cosmetic surgeries like breast augments and facelifts,
thereby trivializing the effects these strong, often irreversible medication has. Another Dutch study observed that alleviation of gender problems does not automatically lead to a happy and lighthearted life, and that on the contrary, sex reassignment surgery can lead to new problems. For example, vaginoplasty often requires follow-up surgeries, long dilation periods for the rest of their life, and is often followed by a host of other problems which are mentioned here. One study showed that proper informed consent, where patients are made aware of the complications that follow, often reduces their desire for transitioning and thereby would reduce the rate of regret after transitioning.
Although in favor of it, this is how the endocrinologist Metzger described the problem of consent with teenagers.
By saying, it's always a good theory that you talk about fertility preservation with a 14-year-old, but I know I'm talking to a blank wall, adding, they'd be like, you, kids, babies, gross. WPATH even views restricting patients with mental disorders from transitioning as discriminatory. Even though we've had cases where patients struggling with mental disorders transition only
My
to
name is
regret.
Prisha Mosley. I'm a detransitioned woman who began a medicalized gender transition starting as a minor. Transition did not fix my distress. I went to my doctor suffering from anorexia, anxiety, depression, and a host of other mental health issues, but instead of helping me with any of these issues or treating the root cause of them, my doctors and my transition exacerbated my mental health issues, and my endocrine system is completely not working.
It's no surprise that clinicians like Dr. Stephen B. Levine resigned his WPATH membership due to his regretful conclusion that the organization and its recommendations had become dominated by politics and ideology rather than by scientific process, as it was years earlier. Same is the case with Dr. Erica Anderson, who is the first transgender president of the American Professional Association for Transgender Healthcare, who stated, "I'm afraid what we are getting are false positives and we have subjected them to irreversible physical changes." Dr. Anderson also resigned from WPATH in 2021. The very same year, a systematic review was published on the clinical guidelines of the Standard of Care 7 published by the WPATH, rating it as not only low quality but as do not recommend. This is the problem we get when politics and ideology come in the way of medicine and science. WPATH is responsible for popularizing and making the gender-affirming care approach as the standard in the West. However, this standard was based on the Dutch protocol, which was a small experiment done on just 70 participants. The 2023 paper, The Myth of Reliable Research, argues that the practice of performing sex trait modifications escaped the lab before there was any strong scientific evidence to support it. It's not saying the practice is harmful, it's just saying we don't have enough evidence to show that it is effective and safe. And this is where we need to be careful, because small experiments are a double-edged sword. They can lead to great harm, like in the case of ovariotomy, or they can bring in life-changing procedures, like in the case of electroconvulsive therapy. This process of electroconvulsive therapy was first viewed as barbaric and dangerous because the first clinicians using this practice didn't know how to administer the process properly. But now we know how to administer it safely, and it is a highly effective treatment. And that's where we are with the Dutch protocol. Maybe it is a highly effective and safe practice, and that we are yet to discover how to make it more effective, or maybe it is just another case of ovariotomy. One of my concerns regarding the medication given to transgender people first started when I watched this clip on the Matt Walsh documentary.
One of the drugs used is Lupron, right? Which has actually been used to chemically castrate sex offenders.
You know what? I'm not sure that we should continue with this interview.
You don't want to talk about the drugs that you give to kids, or?
Puberty blockers are often said to be reversible, but when I saw this pediatrician evading his questions, I was heavily concerned. However, on doing the research, I realized the keyword is chemical castration, which is different from the regular castration where they sever your ding-dongs. Chemical castration has the word castration because it simulates the androgen or testosterone levels which are present during physical castration, which is another way of saying your testosterone levels are zero. And one study showed it was reversible. The study looked at children suffering from early onset puberty, meaning they were hit with puberty at ages like 8 or 9 years old. But the problem was that it was done on children with early onset puberty, not trans individuals who often spend most of their teenage years on puberty blockers. What's more interesting is that the use of puberty blockers for gender related issues is not approved by the FDA. Now, this doesn't mean that puberty blockers are harmful or irreversible, but it definitely means we need more research done on this. Even the study looking at the effects of Lupron on prepubescent kids acknowledged that more research has to be done. Coming back to the Cornell literature review I mentioned earlier, it stated that there was robust international consensus that gender transition, including hormone therapy and surgeries, improves the well-being of transgender individuals. However, more recently in 2022, Sweden's National Board of Health and Welfare released new guidelines for treating young people with gender dysphoria. The new guidelines state that the risk these gender-affirming treatments bring currently outweigh the possible benefits, and the treatment should be offered only in exceptional cases. In June 2020, something similar happened with Finland. Finland's national medical body COHERE released its findings and recommendations regarding youth gender transition. It concluded that the studies doubting the success of the gender-affirming model were biased and unreliable. The fact that these progressive countries where this matter is less politicized are changing their policies should mean something to the rest of the world. Yes, transgender people do exist, and denying their identity definitely isn't the best approach. At the same time, blind affirmation isn't the right approach either. We have covered a lot, and what we consistently see is that we need more research done in this matter. The real danger isn't in being wrong, it's in thinking we already have the answers. However, unfortunately, in the places we need to keep our minds most open, we become most opinionated, tribalistic, and polarized. In the end, this is not even about the transgender issue. It's about navigating truth, ideology, and compassion. It's a problem that we have faced time and time again throughout human history, and it's a problem we will likely continue to face till the end of humanity. And so with that, I would like to end this documentary. I would like to end this as a conversation and not a conclusion. I'd like to hear your thoughts, maybe disagreements, opinions, or points you'd like to add on. I'd love to hear.